Hi there. A quick word from your host. We won an award for the Best Arts and History podcast at the QTT Media Awards last week. So Cold War Conversations is now officially an award-winning podcast, which would not have been possible without all of you that listened to us, those that voted, as well as our financial supporters. Thank you, one and all of you. Now, back to the episode.
Cardinal Wyszynski, he said to the secret police who were about to listen to his sermon, he just pointed at the two secret police guys and says, "Gentlemen, it's a long sermon today. You need 2 reels."
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app. Evan McGilvray has written a number of books on Poland, as well as biographies. He's well versed in Poland and Polish society and away from the usual locations of Krakow and Warsaw. Evan first visited Poland in 1986. 5 years after the declaration of martial law, which triggered the suppression of the free trade union Solidarity in December 1981. He visited some friends he had made via correspondence who lived in the city of Łódź, the third largest city in Poland and an industrial centre. He provides us with great insight away from the intelligentsia, as his friends were workers. We hear in some detail how the Communist Party was perceived, life as a worker, as well as views on Lech Walesa and Solidarity. In the 1990s, Evan interviewed General Jaruzelski, who, as first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, also known as the Communist Party, gave the martial law order in 1981 and remained head of state until 1989. If you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with your friends. It really does help us grow the number of listeners. Now, I do need help to continue to track down these unknown stories of the Cold War and ensure that they are preserved before they are lost. If you can spare it, I'm asking listeners to pledge a small monthly amount per month to help keep us on the air, although larger amounts are welcome too. Plus, you will get the sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a monthly financial supporter, and you bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. Peter Ryan is our host today, and I'm delighted to welcome Evan McGilvray to our Cold War conversation.
The 1980s for me was interesting regarding Poland because, of course, it started off with the Solidarity times, and that interested me. I only could watch it from TV, and then when that was crushed, as we thought, I thought, oh well. And then, for some reason, an opportunity came up in 1986 to visit some friends I'd made through correspondence, to visit the city of Łódź, the most unfashionable part of Poland, I should think. And that's how I started going out there.
So what was Łódź like when you arrived? Can you give us a setting of the scene to first impressions and so forth?
When I travelled from Warsaw to Łódź by train, even getting on the train nobody seemed to speak English. And I just showed a lady my ticket and she made sure I got off at the right place. It was the terminus anyway. But what got me first off was a Catholic priest got on and started saying his prayers. And I'm thinking, oh my grief, how bad is this journey going to be? And anyway, when I got to Łódź, I just got out this train, nobody to meet me, and I just saw a vast array of taxis. Must be about 50 taxis standing in line. And the city just looked grim, because it was. And then I just showed my friend's visiting card to a taxi driver, and his address was so obscure, he just had to walk up and down the taxi line asking his fellow drivers where this street was, and then we were off. The taxi was so shabby, it was unbelievable. The fare meter had to have a big sign, ×2, everything was double. because basically the fare meter just couldn't register the figures, and inflation was yet to really kick in.
Mm-hmm.
And then he dropped me off by a huge block of flats. And I thought, oh no, don't tell me she lives in these block of flats. And it was like one of these sort of post-70s Soviet-style massive blocks of flats. But I saw this lady, and again, I showed her this address because I had no Polish at the time. And amazingly, it was my friend's sister-in-law who took me into this little tiny block, a single-story block of flats. Well, they were, I didn't understand at the time, they actually were a series of rooms. Each room accommodated a family. So families were living in single rooms with children or whatever. Such was the housing shortage in Poland at that time. And from there, I got to know my friends. But so initial impressions there was outside of this house, you just saw poverty, uncut grass, a huge pump. I was yet to learn that was my friend's source of water, outside privies, this sort of thing, in the middle of a major city. But going into the home, because it was my friend's mother's name day, I was shocked at the array of foods available. And again, I didn't understand. It was more like wartime rationing in the UK, where the families worked together to provide whatever was needed for basically what looked to me to be a feast. When I looked at the table, I must say, I thought, oh my God, everything looks so disgusting. What do you want? So I recognise things like tomatoes and eggs. I don't like eggs. And so I just pointed at something, and that turned out to be jellied calf's heel, zimnu nogi, they call it in Polish. And I was cautioned just put some vinegar on it. Now, what was weird to me is the vinegar was clear in colour, but the vodka was brown because it was homemade bimber, hooch, if you will. So, yeah, it was really one of the first impressions of Polish people in a family situation, really friendly. But when I landed at the airport, I remember the customs lady just screaming at me in Polish, and because I must have gone down the wrong place or something. And then you had some circling back a little bit on my very first day, the Orbis official guide who was going to take me around Warsaw. I dumped him. Everything he wanted for dollars. And at one level, hotels, official levels, all they saw Western people were as some kind of financial milk cow. They just wanted the dollars off you so they can exchange it for their zloty and making a bit out of it. So there's like two Polands, when the friends are good, but outside certain people will see you as a way of raising cash. And, it was I'd never encountered anything like that before. It was very odd.
How did you find getting around without speaking Polish? Were you able to make yourself understood in ready fashion? Was there any English language fluency amongst the Polish people that you would have encountered?
No. I had a phrase book, which was a bit useful. I just pointed to things if I needed anything. Within the hotels, yes, they did. Obviously, the hotel front desk staff spoke English. And I remember the porter, the first thing he said to me was, dollars, change dollars. That might have been the limit of his English, but it's what he wanted. But on the whole, it was quite difficult. Travelling to Łódź in the same trip, another time in the same year, I met a Polish student who spoke very good English. But on the whole, I'd say 99% of the people didn't speak English, or not the ones I met. Did have a curious encounter in Warsaw with an elderly gentleman who he told me he would been a German soldier during the war and remained in Poland, which is a bit odd. And he told me about the changing of the guard was about to happen, but he recognised me as an English speaker, probably the way I was dressed, Levi 501 jeans, dressed totally different to the locals. And he didn't want anything. He just gave this piece of information to me in English. So English speakers at that time were rare. But the oddest experience is a little bit out of this remit that we're doing at the moment, was once I was in a very downtown market in Łódź, where a bit of a flea market. This guy is selling shoelaces and whatnot. And I asked him in Polish, and he answered me back in English, because they time I could speak Polish by the 90s. And it turned out he'd been in the DP camps, the displaced person camps, just after the Second World War, and he spoke fluent English, which shook me because the amount of students I taught who struggled with English, and this guy who was selling shoelaces spoke fluent English. It just shook me. But to answer your question shortly, very few people spoke English.
And tell me, how was a young British citizen received by the Polish people? What was the welcome like, sort of in general, when people found out you were from the UK?
Curious, they were sort of curious, they couldn't manage much. I think they sometimes thought I was a bit, there's old things like buying an ice cream. So I went to in the old square in Warsaw and paid my money. So I'd work out how much an ice cream cost. And they gave me a plastic token. And I just looked at that sort of, am I being ripped off? Am I being scammed? And a teacher came over, a school teacher who was with a school outing, and she took me by the hand and took me to the ice cream kiosk where I handed over my disc and gave me, I got an ice cream for it. I thought I could have made more conversation with people if we could have spoke languages. Curiosity was the thing. And, you just stood out. Not many people had wristwatches, for instance, which seemed weird to me. So that people asked me what the time was, and more people. It's very hard to explain. I think it's curiosity. That's how it was. Curious. We had no common language really at that time, outside of my friends' family. Western people were still curious to them, and I think they all sort of looked up to Western people. I don't know why.
That leads me to my next question. It segues perfectly. What were the impressions that you found that Polish people at the time had of, say, Western Europe or the United Kingdom? Did they have any preconceptions? Did they have any thoughts about what the UK might be like, or was it fueled by what they might have been hearing in terms of propaganda?
Well, I think one thing with propaganda, they tend to ignore their own propaganda.
Okay.
So they thought everything was possible in the West. That was what they felt. And they really admired Margaret Thatcher, which I didn't really think much of her, to be quite frank. And I lived in southern England, so I didn't have the real reasons like people in northern England really despised that woman. But they really admired her because they felt that she knew how to speak to the Soviets.
Okay.
And the Iron Lady and all this sort of stuff. And they just thought that the West was a great place of opportunity. A lot of them worked illegally in London, going to Germany, a lot of smuggling trips to Germany, I think, what I got from conversations within the family as it became. And the West was just somewhere, it was an aspiration to them. I think they could get there perhaps one day. I know my friends really aspired to go to Canada to live. So the West it was good. A bit like West Side Story when the Puerto Ricans think everything's possible in America. Mm-hmm. The Polish people I met just thought the West was endless possibilities.
And it's interesting because we know that there, especially in the United States, there's huge pockets of Polish community. Chicago would probably be the biggest one. Did you find that people would perhaps have interacted with the relatives they might have had in Western Europe or in the United States that might have fueled those impressions of the West being the land of opportunity?
Well, absolutely, because one aunt had a brother in Chicago, and my friend had a friend who lives in Canada, hence the wanting to go to Canada. And because these people were able to get houses, own cars, because cars were difficult to get in Poland, and fuel was even harder to get. So, you get a car, you buy a car, you go to the gas station, petrol stations, we say here, and fill it up, no problems, nothing's on ration. No, so much stuff was on ration in Poland. You can go to the shop and buy as much groceries as you can possibly afford. There's nothing's on ration, nothing's short. You didn't need dollars or a special currency to buy the good stuff. You just used your local currency. All these things were good for them, and their families would write back, and their families would send them dollars back. So they looked like that they may have very modest jobs, but they had surplus income to send hard currency back to the people back in Poland, which then can be exchanged on the black market for better stuff or used in the PEVEX shops, the hard currency stores. So at every level, it seemed to them that things were possible, very possible in the West, from their friends and families doing well. But of course, their friends and families did not talk about the minutiae living in these countries, the taxes, the niggling neighbour you might have, or that you might have to put in a whole load of overtime to make this money to send back to your family. That was either ignored or not discussed. That was the thing.
Evan, how were events that were going on in the West covered by the media in Poland at the time? Were there any particular ones that stood out while you were there that you recall?
Not really, no. I should imagine the regime, if it was anything too positive, didn't cover it. I think the only thing that they were interested in was papal visits. Obviously it was Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope. Those were forever fantastic things. I actually went to a papal mass in 1991, and whoa, the Poles really look forward to that sort of thing. But I remember looking at Polish newspapers. It only had 4 sides to their newspapers. The front page would probably be party propaganda, then sort of some local gossip, sports, and the TV guide for the night on the back. So the news wasn't covered that much. And to be honest with you, they just turned off the news. It came on. They had one program which probably was more popular, was called Tele-Express. That was the news delivered at great speed within 15 minutes. That was the total broadcast, and that would come so fast. It was amazing. I assume, though, if I had been in Krakow, for instance, and amongst so-called intellectual people, they might have been listening to Radio Free Europe or having access to that sort of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. But you asked me about what I knew of these people became my family, because I obviously met my wife out there. Mm-hmm. They were just ordinary workers, and they really didn't care. They had enough to get on with.
Right. Well, taking that as a bit of a theme, what was life like for the average Pole who might have been a worker? What would they have done in their spare time? What would have a trip to the supermarket have been like for them?
Supermarkets were largely empty, unfortunately. That was a reality. So spare time would be, for the guys, it was probably doing home repairs. I remember my cousin Wieszek in Janusz as well, fixing their cars when they had cars. Sometimes they had a car between them, or they had some old jalopy, and spent a lot of time doing repairs and home maintenance. They also tended, I noticed, to have parties on a Saturday night, which was interesting. So they looked forward to that feature of the week, because there was really nowhere to go. There were no pubs. So they would do family parties. Quite often, legitimate parties, shall we say, when somebody's name day or some occasion, and sometimes they just had parties for the sheer hell. But shopping, it was a very hard thing, I think. For the ladies did it, the guys just didn't do shopping. And the women could also work an 8-hour shift, look after the kids, and go shopping, which we had a queue for a long time for meat, which was on ration, unless you had another way of getting foods. And I do remember my Aunt Jadwiga, she went out at something like 5 in the morning and came back with stuff I wouldn't give to the dog. But there we are. But within my family, they had family out in the countryside where they could get eggs and meat and stuff from, off the farm, off the small holding and things like that. So a lot of self-sufficiency. And a lot of people also had a thing called a działka, a small holding, an allotment. I don't know how it translates in other English-speaking countries, but basically it's like a big garden where they could grow fruit, maybe have a couple of chicken and things like that. So self-sufficiency was the order rather than shopping.
Let's switch a little bit in terms of popular culture, and I'd love to find out, back in the 1980s in Poland, what the sort of popular music would have been, what would have been listened to. Did they have access to Western music, or was it mainly from the East Bloc?
Popular music, I think, as German and Swedish rock music was very popular, sort of heavy metal
Wow. Okay.
stuff. And I remember I went to Poland in '86, and I came home, and then a few months after that visit, I was watching Top of the Pops, which was a very popular program in the UK. It's gone now on TV, and basically it was the top 40 of the what was popular in Britain that week. And I heard this song, and it was the Final Countdown, and I thought, I've heard that before. And then it hit me, oh my God, I heard that in Poland a few months back. It was by Europa, a Swedish rock group, and so sometimes they're ahead of the curve.
Wow.
But they had, I was shocked. I heard this in Poland first. And they had on the coast a punk festival every year, which really surprised me.
Really?
But, and Scandinavian punks would come to this festival, which really surprised me. And they had, basically they kept looking to the West for their music, especially, like I said, Germany. In fact, one of the guys, a chap called Les Humphreys, came from my hometown and was a friend of my father's. My father always said, oh, Les is very big in Germany. I thought, oh, whatever. And then I'm flicking through a Polish rock magazine, which I can't really read. And then this name, Les Humphreys, kept coming up. I thought, oh, my word. This guy's a bit more popular than I anticipated, but not in the UK. So, the music tastes were different to what I was used to. And some of it I thought was a bit ill. But one story I will tell you, though, is I would send new CDs, albums, vinyls as it was in those days, to cousin Janusz. And initially I thought it was a bit rude, and I realised what was going on. He would record them, then he'd sell the original album I'd sent him on the black market for dollars. And he was able to get stuff like medicine for his mother or for his kids or a treat or whatever, but always ploughed it back in the family. So if Poles got hold of original Western music on original discs, they would pirate it and then sell the originals on the black market for dollars.
I have to ask, what style of music did Les Humphreys play?
I think it was some sort of poppy rock, who I call easy listening or something, If he's the same age as my father, he'd been born in the 30s, And
Okay.
It didn't take off in England.
Well, I guess any port in a storm. Did you hear much of Dean Reed in Poland back in the 1980s? Do you remember him being popular?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't mean to say he wasn't. It might have been. His cousin Janusz was a real, Genesis and Queen fiend, all this sort of stuff. So if he wasn't in that genre, I probably didn't get to hear it.
Got it. Okay, cool. Evan, what was the television beyond the current events programs? What type of TV shows would have been playing on Polish networks, or what would you have found in the cinema? Was there anything that jumped out at you of note that perhaps came from the West, or was it all mainly locally produced?
I think a lot of it was locally produced because Łódź is the film school area anyway, was one thing.
Okay, wow.
What's his name? Polanski trained there. A lot of the top Polish film directors and that actually trained in Łódź. But cinemas, they were tiny little places. I didn't actually go into any until I moved out there in the 90s. But there seemed to be like there was one with the Second World War from the outside, a little kino written over the top, and I really couldn't work out what they were showing. Polish TV seemed to be a complete mishmash of stuff. I remember they're just showing families doing judo once on the TV at Christmas time. I thought, this is bizarre. Why? The news, as I said, was really a bit mad. Flintstones in Polish was curious. And I remember in the UK, we actually had Polish film Night and Day ran as a series on Channel 4. But yes, there was one, Chłopi, Peasants. That was a good programme. I liked that. I followed it as best I could. That was quite a long runner. But I think they tried getting their idea of culture. Obviously Polish classics were very popular. The Saint was popular with old people. But yeah, there was some old. And I remember watching Jaws one Christmas, and Jarvis, as they said it, because Jaws, Jarvis, is how you pronounced it. They kept me, Jarvis. What on earth is Jarvis? And Jaws. And I fell asleep, probably because I'd drunk too much vodka at the party. And I thought, golly, I woke up and thought, golly, this film's finishing. They haven't censored it that much, surely. Because that's how my mind thought. They censored everything, but I don't think the Poles really did censor too much. TV, I think, if it was Western, they would watch it regardless. I think there was Emmanuel was on one evening, and of course they all ran home to watch it. The soft porn film. Oh, I remember. Yeah, there is one story. They made a film called Sex Missia in the 80s, and that is again it's a space thing, but sort of soft porn. Odyssey 2001 or something film. They sort of Arthur C. Clarke with no clothes on. And that was very popular. They were very proud of that film. They were Sex Missia. The Smurfs were popular. You remember the Smurfs?
I do, yeah. I had a big collection of them.
Yeah, that was very popular. So a lot of Western stuff was popular, but there's some Polish classics in there. Sometimes I wish that British TV would show some of the Polish stuff. Like Chłopy Peasants is a very good story. It's 4 seasons in the 1870s of a Polish village and how their lives are, their adventures, their misadventures, and so on. And I think people would be interested.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking that Christmas Day watching Jaws might actually be more palatable than the annual showing of The Sound of Music that they put on in Canada. I probably shouldn't say that because Christopher Plummer just passed away, and I know no ill will meant, but I was always a big Jaws fan. So anyway, so Evan, in terms of the experience that you had, just sort of day-to-day life within Łódź and within your time in Poland, was there ever any point where you felt that you might have been watched or surveyed by the intelligence services?
No, not at all. I mean, I remember being on a train in the mid-80s with a young lad, and he was telling me about the meat shortages in Poland. In English, we had this thing, and we spent the 2 hours from Warsaw to Łódź discussing all these sort of things. And he got off. He says, only in Poland could meat be a political question. And I thought, this country is not scared of its intelligence services. But a guy I know who lives in Bradford now, he was training to be a priest. But basically, it was the Cardinal Wyszynski. He said to the secret police who were about to listen to his sermon, he just pointed to the 2 secret police guys and says, gentlemen, it's a long sermon today. You need 2 reels. That priest was not scared of the Secret Service.
It doesn't sound like it. It really doesn't. And that's a nice angle to talk a little bit about the whole interaction between the regime and the Catholic Church. What was that coexistence like based on what you saw when you were in Poland?
Well, the Catholic Church was obviously the dominant partner of Polish society in my mind. I mean, the Secret Service, I can't honestly know if I saw it was the Secret Service ignored. The Catholic Church was respected, especially by the rural people living in the villages and by those born before the 50s, I'd say. But a decent amount of young people also respected the church. If you went to Mass, now I am a practicing Catholic, I rarely get to have to stand up in a church, let alone stand outside in the cold on the steps, some distance from the building itself, because that is how the churches were in the 80s, absolutely packed beyond belief. And the church and Solidarity were seen as working together all the time. I mean, that is Secret Service, the intelligence services, they were nowhere in my mind. But the church was very dominant by the 80s. And of course, having Pope John Paul II as the leader of the Catholic Church really helped.
What were your overall impressions of the regime in Poland in the 1980s? What stuck out for you in terms of what it was like, its orientation, its approach to governance?
It just wasn't really there. I mean, you get off an airplane at Warsaw in those days, and there's a soldier fully armed at the bottom of the steps, and that's the last bit of the regime you see. You really just didn't. I mean, you didn't. I remember speaking to the Polish defense attaché in London in the late 90s, and he said to me once, "Did you ever see a red flag in Poland?" I said, "Apart from 22nd July, the Communist Independence Day, no. Did you see statues? No." And basically, communist Poland did not look like communist Poland. There was nothing really to suggest the communists are running, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I really expected to see these banners, and lots of things, forward with the party and all this sort of stuff. And the only time I saw anything like that was, again, in the 90s in a factory museum where the banners and the placards were being used for clearing snow. You just didn't notice the communist regime in Poland unless I feel you were some dissident or really acting against the regime. If you did, most people just got on with their lives and ignored the regime. New Year's Eve, when Jaruzelski addressed the people, he just got turned off. They didn't buy the paper. They didn't buy the party paper. Well, my wife's family certainly didn't. They bought the local Łódź paper and a dreadful paper called Express, which was basically, as I described to you, probably some propaganda on the front. On Fridays, I had a young lady who decided to take her blouse off, and TV guide, sports, and that's it. There was no real interaction with ordinary people. They may have joined in the strikes in the early 80s, but on the whole, they just kept away from the regime, and I think the regime kept away from them. I remember reading a BBC report, summary of world broadcasts, and Jaruzelski supposed to have visited a factory in the mid-80s, and apparently they took all the rough factory girls out, as they described them, gave them the day off, and put the girls from the office into the factory so Jaruzelski could meet some nice, gentle ladies rather than these rough industrial factory girls. I mean, so the ordinary workers ignored the regime, and I think the regime ignored them, unless they kicked off.
The impression you're giving me, Evan, is that unlike a lot of the East Bloc countries that we've heard about on Cold War conversations, where there was an omnipresent sense of the regime that really encapsulated work, education, and home life, in Poland, it seems that they were almost lurking in the background, but really never out there.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly what it is, like that. The communists never really got into Poland proper, especially after 1956, when Gomulka took over. My wife's grandmother, she was born in 1914, so you can guess how old she was, late 40s, early 50s. And she did say, when Beirut, the Stalinists, were running Poland, you did put that red flag on your building or your name got taken. It was hard, she said, but once Gomulka came in, communism was virtually over in Poland, apart from the occasional workers' uprising. And you had the scarcity of consumer goods I've already described. But on the whole, there was not an oppressive regime, unless you chose to revolt. And I think it's quite interesting how many different leaders they had in Poland during the communist regime. I think they got through one every 10 years on average. Some lasted 6 months. Gomulka lasted 20-odd years. Well, you look at some of the other countries, they lasted for 30, 40 years. Because Poland kept changing their regimes.
What did the Polish people have in terms of their own impressions about the Soviets? What did you pick up when perhaps something about the Soviet Union was discussed, or when you would see it on television or in any aspect of popular culture? Generally speaking, what was their view of the whole element of the Soviets and their place in the East Bloc?
Well, obviously they knew that the Soviets are in charge, but they disliked the Russians, because that predates communism, of course, because of the imperial system and the partitions of Poland. But I remember arguing with them as best I could about Gorbachev, because in the West, as you may recall, Gorbachev was seen as this reformer, somebody we could work with, so on. And they just said, no, their attitude was, he's a bloody Russian, end of story, don't trust him. We like Reagan, we like Thatcher. They just didn't trust the Russians. And again, the only time I saw Russian armed forces in Poland was in 1991. In fact, it was the time of the coup, which thought, oh my God, what's going on here? Basically, it was a Russian army truck passing through Łódź. And the following year, when the Russian tanks were going back eastward on train flatbeds, the tanks were passed up on trains and being taken back to Russia. I mean, you had very little interaction with the Soviets. Even the guys, virtually all of Ella's family had been conscripted into the Polish army, for the military service. And apart from one uncle who had served in the 50s, they actually had very little interaction with the Soviet forces. There were no, like NATO have war games between the various NATO armies and exercises together. There was very little, if any, interaction with the Soviet armies or any of the Warsaw Pact armies. So basically, in short, the Soviet Union really made little impact on ordinary people's lives. They knew they were in charge and they could get invaded if they went, like the Czechs have been invaded and the Hungarians have been invaded. And indeed, I was in Poland for the 1989 elections when the Communist Party were kicked into touch. And I said to my cousin, what do you think is going to happen now? And he actually thought the Soviets might militarily intervene. Mm-hmm. As we know, nothing happened.
Yeah.
So that's right. Basically, I mean, Poland always stood, the Soviets were always a little bit afraid of Poland, I feel, because it was such a big country. And it was, I mean, they scared. They also knew that the Polish army would go on the Polish people's side. That's sort of an unwritten thing between the Polish people and the Polish army, that the Polish army is well respected and it will always stick up for its people. That's what I feel. And I think the Soviets were always scared of the Polish army, especially after 1956.
So obviously there's a few dominant personalities in Poland throughout the Cold War. One of them was Lech Walesa. When you were in Poland, what were your general impressions of him? Was he pervasive in popular culture and media?
Well, when I first went out there, he was a bit of a non-person because he'd sort of been disappeared by the regime, shall we say? Because when he came back, I mean, they did have great respect for him because he was this guy who literally put his head above the parapet and defied the regime and made them give in a bit. But what I did notice is, as the years passed, he got to be more and more unpopular, especially his presidency. So all the time he wasn't. All the time he was an underground figure. He was very popular. But the minute he became part of the system, he was popular as an underground figure, but once he became mainstream, he became increasingly unpopular with the Polish people.
Why do you think that is?
They considered, I think they considered him to be corrupt. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that he had got money from various sources, and they were embarrassed when he was president because he spoke workers Polish. He spoke like a normal guy in the street, and the students I was teaching and middle class people and upwards actually thought he was a bit of a joke, and I think the working class people didn't feel that he had changed that much. Their lives hadn't changed that much. Okay, so they could vote, they could have their passports, because under the regime, there was a thing that was different, was you had to hand in your dovert, the internal passport, in order, first you had to get permission to travel abroad, and secondly, you had to go and ask for a passport for external travelling. So after 1989, anybody could get a passport and travel where the hell they liked. So that was a plus. But again, most of the minutiae of life hadn't changed that much for ordinary people.
It seems like he was caught between two poles. The people who, no pun intended, but really as you were saying, the more middle class and intellectual classes who didn't feel he was an adequate representation of what they wanted a president to be, and then the working class where he came from, who felt that he hadn't really achieved anything for them.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
So, Evan, how do you think he will be remembered historically?
Well, I think, once he dies, and I wish him well, he probably go back to revert to being a hero in Poland. They did it with Pope Paul II. But I remember the last 10 years, do you know the British publication New Statesman?
Yes, of course.
He and Pope John Paul II came out in the top 100 of a poll run by the New Statesman of great people of the 20th century. So in Britain, we still think he is a great guy. And people may say, oh, what happened to Lech, and it's Wałęsa, but people have different ways of saying that. And you tell him, well, he's still around. He was the president for a while, and blah blah blah. So he's actually more popular in the West than he is in Poland as it stands at the moment. But I think in the long term in history, he will be seen in a better light than he is seen today in Poland. So
during your time in the 1980s in Poland, did you have any contacts with Solidarity?
Well, not official ones, but I mean in the sense of I knew people who later, my wife had been in Solidarity. She'd been arrested. But my wife to be his girlfriend at the time. And some of friends I found out later were closer to Solidarity than I'd realised. And some were actually running some of the underground stuff locally. So, yes, I did.
Okay. Well, flipping the sides for a second, one of the really interesting things, or one of the many interesting things that I picked up on when you and I chatted prior to our discussion today was the fact that you'd spent some time with General Jaruzelski. How did that come about?
Well, I was doing some research at University of Bradford into, at the time, Poland was seeking to join NATO, and I was looking for people to interview. And I approached Jaruzelski's office, and one morning when I'm actually at the university, the phone rings, and my wife, who'd been in Solidarity and had been arrested, picks up the phone, and says, on the other side, it says, "This is Jaruzelski's office. Can I speak to your husband?" And my wife nearly dropped the phone in shock.
Oh my goodness! You can't make this stuff up.
No. And but the good thing was of Jaruzelski agreeing to speak to me was that in 1999, I was trying to do elite interviews with Polish politicians and senior officers and the like, and none of them would come back to me. So I went to see my contact at the Polish embassy, Wojciech Szalakowski, Colonel Wojciech Szalakowski, and I said to him, "Look, Wojciech, I've got a problem. The only person willing to see me, and I'm going to Poland next month, is General Jaruzelski." And he said, "That is so embarrassing." And then he said to me, "You know Janusz Wojciechowicz?" I said, "I do." He says, "Right. Write to him," because by then Janusz I first met Janusz when he was the opposition defence minister. And by this time, when I was speaking to Wojciech, he was the defence minister of Poland. And he said, "Write to Mr. Wojciechowicz in Polish at his yachting club," because the point was we're avoiding his office because the secretary probably just binned the letter. Mm-hmm. And I did so. I said, explain my position, my problems. And then I got a weird email which didn't make sense. So I just said, "What's going on here?" And on the same day, again, my wife was at home and she got another phone call from a Colonel Malacek. And he says, "My boss says we've got to go work with your husband next month." And he was very stroppy about it. And then I got an email. I had a whole load of interviews lined up with Admiral Piotr Kolodejczyk, who had been a defence minister, Jan Paris, Radek Sikorski. Well, from Jan Paris, I got into contact with Radek Sikorski, and loads of different officers and senior politicians, all off the back of the Jaruzelski agreeing to see me because they were shamed into seeing me.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. What were your impressions when you met Jaruzelski?
Oh, yeah, I mean, obviously, you're going in, you're meeting a former dictator. Yeah. And I remember going to his door, knocking on his office door, and it said, W. Jaruzelski, były President Polska, the former president of Poland. Knocked on the door, went into his ante-office, and said who I was. My wife was with me because my Polish is pretty good, but it just brings the conversation along quicker if she does simultaneous translation.
Sure.
And we were ushered into his presence, and he was just an old man. He didn't look so old. He must have been 70-something, wearing English tweeds. I looked at his eyes because, the dark glasses stuff. Mm-hmm. And yes, his eyes the rims were twice as thick as yours and mine because of this experience he had when he was a prisoner of the Soviets in the snow and everything. And impressions of him, he was very polite. He had a sense of humour, which did surprise me. He was a mimic, but he was also very anxious to put the record straight. That's why he was seeing academics and journalists and whatnot. And he said to me he was no Pinochet, which is absolutely true. He may have been a military dictator, but he was no Pinochet. So that's what he wanted to make quite clear. But one thing did attract my attention, it had nothing to do with any of the work I was doing, was I saw a disabled young man in his office. And I thought, that's interesting, because Polish attitude to disability is extremely negative even to this day. And during the communist times, you just did not really see disabled people in the streets. My mother-in-law's now passed, but she had multiple sclerosis and was lame, and she was virtually housebound, not because of her disabilities. Nobody wanted to take her out. So for Jaruzelski to employ a disabled man, I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what surprised you the most about him when you met him, Evan? You've talked about the sense of humor, his mimicry. Was there anybody in particular he was especially good at mimicking?
Yeah, Gomorka. You know how Gomorka used to give him orders, and you go, oh God. But he told me one thing which I actually used. He told me that communism was born ill in Poland, and that's why it never worked.
Well, he'd have been at the coalface and probably would have known better than anybody, really.
Well, yeah, but he said he was born an aristocrat, and he became General Secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party. Well, he did name a particular archbishop who was the son of a proletariat, an industrial worker, and he became a senior clergyman. So that's how turned upside down Poland is. And I asked him about NATO. Poland was at that time on the cusp of going into NATO, and he thought it was the best idea ever. And I'm thinking, hang on, you were one of the senior generals of the Warsaw Pact, and you think NATO's a good idea? So fine. He's just very open. I think by this time, in 1999, he's 75, I think he is, at that time. And it's not that he didn't care. It was nothing to do with him anymore. And he could put things on record. Nobody's going to arrest him and deport him to the back end of Siberia. And he's already had that done to him anyway. So he wasn't bothered anymore.
So I'll flip this question to you about Jaruzelski, like I asked about Walesa. How do you think history will remember him?
He has actually remained very popular in Poland. I mean, most people in the West probably don't really remember him at all, unless they are students of the Cold War or something. But in Poland, it's very positive about him because they still maintain that he kept the Soviets out of Poland in 1981. It's still debatable whether that's true or not. More and more light is being shed on these questions. But they were probably right. I mean, he did keep them out, and it would have been a bloodbath if the Soviets had tried intervening, as they like to call it, i.e. invading. So, yeah, in Poland, it's a very positive thing, not only just with the former communists and that, but the ordinary people think that I don't think they say he was a good man, but he understood, and he made the compromises that perhaps they've all had to make, especially those who were born in the 20s of the wartime generation. They all had to make compromises, and he understood those compromises, and they understood his compromises. I mean, he didn't set out to be a communist in my head. His father died, I think, in front of him in the Soviet mines. And he joined the Polish army just to get out of those mines. And then when he got back to Poland at the end of the war, he'd been wounded twice in the fighting. His widowed mother and sister needed supporting, so he just remained in the Polish army. And one thing led to another, because you could remain outside of the Communist Party up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, I found out. And basically he wanted to get on. Was he a committed communist? I don't really know. It's hard to tell. But yeah, his place in history in Poland is assured as a positive thing, unless some piece of paper in the archive was something quite different.
Don't miss the extra information and videos, which will show as a link in your podcast app. If you can't wait for the next episode, please visit our Facebook discussion group, where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Now, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast without the generous support of our patrons. However, I want to especially thank our Politburo level members who are contributing a generous $30 a month to keep us on the air. They are Tony Sowards, Sam Hardwick, Nicholas Butter, Mark Labance, Stephen Kovalich, Jeffrey Jones, Matthew Comstock, Ryan Vlaming, Frederick Esposito, Jack Madwed, and Peter Ryan. Don't forget, if you like one of those Cold War Conversations coasters and help support the show, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.